1/6 of the world's electricity is generated by hydropower. Hydro produces more electricity than every other renewable source combined, though solar is quickly catching up and has by far the most newly installed power production capacity each year. For now, though, hydro produces even more than all global nuclear power plants produce, which is quite a lot, something like 4,500 terawatt hours in 2020. Hydro is also generally considered to be quite flexible and reliable and time-tested compared to other renewable energy options. The basic setup of a hydroelectric dam, which is the most common way to generate hydropower, is to dam a river, block it off, and then force the water to filter through holes in the dam that contain turbines, which are spun by the water, and that spinning generates electricity. The amount of energy produced can be increased or decreased on demand within minutes, as the folks running the dam can choose to allow more water through, with no turbines involved, or they can allow less water through, forcing more turbine spinning, and thus generating more energy. They also typically have reservoir systems, so they can keep water stored in what amounts to an artificial lake, so that even if water isn't coming down the river at the desired rate, there's generally still plenty of extra water on hand to keep those turbines going from earlier water flows. This general method of power generation, tapping the movement of water for energy, is very old, dating back to at least the ancient Greeks and ancient Chinese, and likely before that as well, possibly dating all the way back to Babylon and Sumeria, in some shape at least. Way back then, the natural movement of water was tapped to power things like mills, using what's called a water wheel, and sometimes multiple water wheels all lashed together to power a mechanical grain grinding mechanism that would allow grain for bread and similar products to be processed a whole lot faster than would be possible using just human or animal power. Sawmills were later powered by the same energy captured from primarily rivers, and hammers and bellows used for blacksmithing were also powered by water wheels in ancient China. And we've found examples of blacksmiths with this type of setup in China, dating all the way back to the Han Dynasty, so from sometime between 200 BC and 200 AD. Hydropower has been used in mining, in agriculture, to power hydraulic mechanisms in factories, and in paper production, stamp mills, and eventually in the production of electricity on both macro and micro scales. The earliest known case of the latter dating back to the early 20th century, when an English engineer built a tiny electrical power station for his home, while hydropower turbines were used to generate electricity for a commercial plant built along Niagara Falls in 1895, so a much larger version of the same general concept. This type of power generation, then, has been used since the beginning of recorded history, and it has been used to generate electricity since, more or less, back when we first started using electricity for technological, modern society purposes. Once we harnessed it, we started generating it with water. Over that long period of use, we have gotten pretty good at optimizing the various components involved, from the shape and size and build of the turbines to how to manage flow and reservoirs and optimally convert all that kinetic water energy into electrical energy, and then how to send that electrical energy elsewhere. In some cases, the energy is stored rather than immediately used or shuffled to some other destination. Hydro can be useful for this purpose as well. And pumped storage hydroelectricity basically involves using energy generated from all sorts of sources, including hydroelectric dams, to move water either uphill or into water towers. So really, to someplace high up that will allow gravity to then pull that water downward later, so that when you need to reclaim the energy expended to pump that water to the higher altitude, it will flow downward of its own accord, and you can recapture some of that energy using turbines, similar to what you would have in a more standard hydroelectric dam, though in this case, instead of a river, you have water falling downward from that reservoir or that water tower into which you pumped the water previously. You can also generate electricity using turbines spun by the movement of oceanic tides, and similar mechanisms have been used mostly experimentally thus far to capture the movement of undersea currents. So anything that moves predictably in this way can at least theoretically be tapped for energy if you can figure out how to efficiently do so, and then carry that energy to where you need it to be. What I'd like to talk about today is hydropower, some hydro-related issues that we are currently facing, and its role in the global transition to renewables that we are in the midst of at this moment in history. You are listening to Let's Know Things. I'm Colin Wright. It has been a tricky year for all news entities, so if you're in the position to do so, and if you're finding value in this or any news publication, please consider becoming a supporter. In the case of Let's Know Things, the simplest way to do that is to become a patron at patreon.com/letsknowthings. You can also become a member at understandery.com and support this and all of my projects. Supporters who contribute monetarily via either method gain access to an ad-free version of this show and an additional episode of the show each month. A huge thanks to everybody who's already helping to support this podcast, and thank you in advance if you're considering doing so in the future. All right, let's get back to the show. The article I'd like to start with today comes from The Guardian, and it's entitled, "China Drought Causes Yangtze to Dry Up, Sparking Shortage of Hydropower." China uses a lot of energy, the most in the world actually, and by a fair margin. Exact data is tricky on this for any nation, and in China perhaps more than most, because of how its government is set up. But the best figures available for 2021 show that the country used about 8.3 million gigawatt hours of electricity that year, which is more than double the United States consumption of the same. And for context, a gigawatt is enough electricity to power about 750,000 US homes, and a gigawatt hour is that much energy output by an energy source for an hour. Now, important to note here is that the US is also less than 1/4 China's size, with around 330 million people compared to China's 1.4 billion-ish. So on a per capita scale, the amount of electricity used per person, US citizens on average use quite a lot more energy than the average Chinese citizen. And while not at the top of the global per capita energy usage list, the US is up there, consistently near the bottom of the top 10 highest energy use per capita countries each year. Specifics aside, though, what's important to understand is that China is massively reliant on huge energy production projects, and that's part of why it's always scrambling to build new, monument-sized infrastructure, like giant dams and power plants, but also why it spends so much time and treasure building relationships with other countries that have resources they need to continue churning out batteries and steel and the other material necessities for producing all that energy-making, energy-storing, energy-distributing stuff. The Chinese government has also been rapidly pulling impoverished, mostly rural citizens out of poverty and into more urban environments, which has been a largely successful undertaking, but has also taxed their various systems and social structures, including their energy-related systems and infrastructure. So in addition to just needing a lot of energy resources all the time, they also need an ever-increasing quantity of such things, which means they are not just building to reinforce what they've already got, they're building to accommodate the rapidly expanding appetite of their rapidly ballooning middle class for more energy. Big energy production, then, is key to their continued functioning and enriching and flourishing, and that means producing a whole lot of hydroelectric dams and coal power plants, both of which can be scaled up so that a given energy generating installation produces a lot of energy, and both tap into relatively cheap and abundant sources of energy. In the former case, China's rivers, and in the latter case, all the cheap coal China can soak up from both local and international sources. The Chinese government has been trying to shift more of its investments toward clean energy resources, though, in part because of commitments it has made, alongside most of the rest of the international community, to make big moves toward reducing greenhouse gas emissions by the middle of the century. but also because China has long had air quality issues, and some of their cities are cloaked in ever present smog if they're not careful, which is bad for health outcomes and for overall citizen well being and happiness, something that they are keen to account for and control to maintain stability. Thus, solar and wind are becoming more of a thing throughout China, but they've also been doubling down on hydro. And the Yangtze River, which is the world's third largest and China's most vital internal waterway, is important for things like shipping and increasingly for the hydropower it generates for some of the country's largest and most economically important regions. One such region, Sichuan, gets more than 80% of its energy from hydropower, mostly hydropower based on the Yangtze River. And in August of 2022, the Yangtze dropped to about half its usual water levels, reducing the inflow to hydro dam reservoirs, the stockpiled water that they keep on hand for shortages. And that drop reduced energy output at the same time. Local demand for energy was increasing by 25%. That increase in energy demand and the decrease in water levels on the river were triggered by the same variable, a record-breaking drought that arrived in parallel to, and which was amplified by, a severe heat wave that plagued parts of China for more than 2 months. This heat wave broke hundreds of high-temperature records throughout the region, and it nudged locals into using their air conditioners and other power-hungry devices more consistently. It also exacerbated other problems like meager agricultural yields by drying up the soil, which in turn required more water and more energy-hungry attention from farmers. All of this created a spiral of compounding effects which made a water and heat crisis worse and worse, taxing local infrastructure, health systems, and tempers, while also necessitating that many manufacturing hubs shut down in order to conserve power. This was a weather issue, then, that was compounded by human-amplified climate change, which went on to severely negatively impact human well-being, economic performance, and the status of local infrastructure, which was strained and worn and pushed beyond safe and optimal operational limits. Other variables also influenced and were influenced in return by this heat wave and drought, including the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, which has continued at a relatively low level throughout China, but which can have short, potent impacts on regions that see outbreaks because of the government's COVID-0 approach, which involves completely locking down areas that experience outbreaks, which in turn can lead to business shutdowns and people missing work, and all sorts of other social and economic disruptions. But this general problem, that of compounding climate-related issues being exacerbated by droughts and the consequent reduction of water resources leading to energy problems because of the world's reliance on hydropower, is far from a China-only thing. This is something we're seeing happen around the world, and because of how widespread hydropower is, arguably with good reason, this is likely to become an ever greater issue as weather patterns continue to shift into new and more extreme shapes. And energy infrastructure also evolves, but much more slowly, into its own new post-fossil fuel formation. Adding insult to injury, in several recent cases of hydropower shortages triggered or worsened by droughts and heat waves are subsequent, in some cases near immediate, flooding conditions that follow. This happened recently in China, and in parts of East Africa, South Africa, the United States, most potently, this year at least, in Texas, Missouri, Illinois, and Kentucky, Pakistan, parts of Europe, Japan, and South Korea, among others. Drought often hardens the soil, making it less good at absorbing heavy rainfall, which tends to make flash floods more common as a consequence. Damage from flooding also gets worse as plant life dies off from droughts, their root systems, which typically hold soil together and prevent erosion, disappearing or weakening, which in turn leads to coastal land loss and the degradation of local soil and ecosystems. These events are coming in pairs more often, too, because of the whip-crack back-and-forth extremes attributable to climate change, which, and if you wanted a heuristic for what we can expect in the coming years, this is a pretty decent one, is basically making unlikely weather events more likely, as it shifts climactic bands from what have become their norms over the past several thousand years into new, rapidly changing patterns. So everything we've become accustomed to and built for is changing. And as part of that changing process, once in 1,000 year rainfall is becoming an every few years thing. And heat waves, hurricanes, and blizzards are doing the same. Rare stuff is becoming common. Things that didn't happen in some areas are now happening in those areas. And this is survivable, but we haven't built for it yet. We have built for the previous outgoing paradigm. And we will eventually get better at dealing with all of these extremes, but we are not there yet. And we probably won't be there for decades, at least. Consequently, we are going to continue to experience this kind of whiplash in weather events, and that means we will also continue to see the depletion of farmland, insufficient energy production, and all sorts of issues related to food and livable real estate and water scarcity, and so on. All of which, by the way, will also contribute to what's usually called climate migration, which basically means people who have always lived in one area suddenly not being able to survive in that area. Maybe because water is no longer available there, maybe because their homes and land have all washed away. And that'll lead to mass migrations of people heading elsewhere, unintentionally stressing the local infrastructure wherever they go, and further compounding all of these issues, even if they don't intend to, and would almost certainly prefer to stay put if they could survive while doing so. That aforementioned drought, followed by flooding in Pakistan, is a perfect and truly unfortunate example of exactly this effect. As of the day I'm recording this, more than 1,100 people have been confirmed killed by flooding that has covered about 1/3 of all of Pakistan in water, forcing more than 33 million people, more than 15% of the country's total population, to flee their homes. That's a lot of people. That is way more people than live in some entire countries. And this is happening in a part of the world that's already a bit tumultuous, politically and economically and ecologically, to say the least. It will cost tens of billions of dollars to rebuild, and about half of all the crops planted across Pakistan have already been washed away, which will lead to some significant food shortages throughout the region as well. But this will likely happen again in this area, and though there are things that can be done to help reduce the amount of damage caused each time, it will take time and even more money to build those types of bulwarks. Another heuristic worth understanding here, then, is that climate-related issues do not operate in isolation. Heat waves by themselves are not ideal. They kill people, they destroy infrastructure, they tax energy systems, and they melt roads and kill plants and animals, and they dry up soil. But the compounding impacts of all of these individual issues add up as energy systems are strained. Less energy is produced because of lower water levels. Health systems are weakened by that lack of energy and by a surge of people needing assistance and treatment. Food levels drop. Bulwarks against disaster, like stored energy and food and good health, plummet, making future disasters more likely. The environment suffers, making soil less productive. Ecosystems become less resilient, and entire areas become less overall habitable over time. Things we invest in, like homes and manufacturing facilities, are destroyed or rendered useless because of a lack of water or energy or other resources. And hydropower sources are not the only energy generation systems that suffer when the climate shifts in this way. Nuclear power stations have been at risk of shutdowns recently too, as most existing models require a lot of water to keep things cool. Changing wind patterns, likewise, could reduce the efficiency of wind turbines, just as an increase in cloudier days in formerly sunny areas, and or a lack of water to clean dust from their surface can reduce the efficiency of solar panels. All of these things are bad individually, but even worse in aggregate because of the short and long-term damage they cause. And though we are making good progress in producing more resilient systems, using a mix of energy types, for instance, makes it less likely that one major issue will collapse the entire energy network. There are so many holes to plug, and we are being forced to bail out water from a sinking ship, even as we try to build what amounts to an entirely new ship, using entirely new schematics that are somewhat untested, at least at this scale, on top of the old one. Some of the solutions we are investing in, fortunately, are a lot more flexible than what we have today. In terms of energy, building smart grids, or even virtual power plants, which are essentially networked collections of at-home solar panels and batteries, along with large-scale wind farms and nuclear power plants, and even still functioning oil and coal-fired plants that can detect when the grid is being strained, even if just in one region, and shift more power where it's needed, constantly and automatically balancing and tweaking and storing and recalibrating to ensure that energy remains available and relatively inexpensive throughout the network. These systems are wildly imperfect right now and not widely deployed, but they are one example of what we are building toward. We're not just replacing oil and coal with wind turbines and solar panels and hydroelectric dams. We're trying to build more flexible paradigms within all these spaces so that the weaknesses of each of these energy production methods, and each does have weaknesses and strengths, so that those weaknesses don't leave us in another different sinking ship situation in a few years or decades. We are attempting to reassess how all of these things fit together and account for changes in the environment as we build, in other words, which is something that will be vital to our energy and everything else related future, because the environment in many ways will continue to change around us for quite some time, mostly for the worse by our standards for such things. So flexibility and an understanding of these cascades and compounding effects will be important to our continued survival and flourishing. If you're enjoying Let's Know Things, consider becoming a supporter. One of the simplest ways to do that is to become a patron at patreon.com/letsknowthings. You can also become a supporter of this and all of my projects at understandery.com. This has been an absolutely horrible year for creators in general, but folks working in the journalism space in particular. Your support means the world to me, and it's the reason that I'm able to continue producing these episodes each week. As a thank you, folks who support this show via either of those methods gain access to an additional episode of the show each month and an ad-free version of the show. A great big thanks to everyone who is already helping to support this show. Seriously, that means a lot. Thank you very much. And thanks in advance if you're considering doing so in the future. The book I'd like to recommend today is called The Death of the Artist: How Creators Are Struggling to Survive in the Age of Billionaires and Big Tech by William Deresiewicz. This book is actually pretty relevant to what I just mentioned about it being a tricky time for creators, people making things. But it gets even deeper into it than just looking at the world and saying, oh no, numbers are decreasing, I hope I'll be able to pay my rent. It actually gets into some of the forces and incentives that have conspired to raise certain activities and work and investments in terms of economic importance and the consequent rewards associated with them, and has, as a countervailing force, pushed some things down and caused us, in some countries at least, to devalue things like creative work or work that deals with emotional labor, two very broad fields that encompass huge numbers of professions and which are vital to the functioning of society, but which are discounted in terms of the economic rewards, the amount people are paid for engaging in such work, and how some of this ties back to culture and historical precedent and things like that, but some of it is more related to business models and folks at the top of certain industries wanting to make sure that they can continue to make tons of money as rent seekers while encouraging people to do a whole lot of work for them without, arguably, properly compensating people for that work. Now, that is a very big statement, and it is a very big collection of ideas contained in this book, and if you're anything like me, you will probably be angry most of the time reading it. But if any of that sounds interesting, if those concepts seem relevant to you, consider picking up a copy of The Death of the Artist by William Deresiewicz. You can find out more about me and my work at Colin.io. You can find the show notes and transcript for this and every episode of the podcast at letsknowthings.com. You can find a bundle of my other work, including my other podcasts, at understandery.com. And especially relevant to this episode, you can find my newest project, Climate Happenings, at climatehappenings.com. Feel free to reach out and say howdy on social media. I am Colin Wright on Facebook, and @Colin is my name on most of the other ones. Thank you so very much for listening. I'm Colin Wright, and I'll talk to you again next week.